All right, we're back again with another 5 sheet today. Remember, the 5 sheet is a free open source tool that we can use to analyze these different news articles, like this one here from CNN, help us cut through some of the fakery these guys use, some of the machinations they use to keep us coming back for more of their fake news or to direct us towards the narrative they prefer. And this is a simple, light tool. The way I think about it is just one pass under the jeweler's glass, not too light of an analysis, not too heavy. Goldilocks zone, something that most people can do on a regular basis. Just get you the information you want out of the news without making a profession out of it. So let's get started. The headline is They Write It. Trump loses his impeachment team amid unfaltering loyalty from the GOP. So is that a fact or opinion? I said that's a fact, not much editorialization there. I paraphrased it. Trump parts with his impeachment team despite effort from GOP, or support from GOP. So what's the bias here? CNN, establishment left. They're not right wing. They're not true progressive. They're like corporatist Democrat establishment. All right, what's the thesis? This is going to be an opinion. It's in this first paragraph. Trump's lies and his insistence that the election was rigged against him may have turned out to be a bridge too far, so a lot of editorialization in there. That's not a falsifiable fact. So, the way I paraphrased it, Trump's complaints about the election and his general lies may have been too much for the attorneys tapped to defend him in the impeachment. Alright? And then, what evidence do they have supporting that? They link to this article right here, CNN first reported. It says, a person familiar with the departures told CNN, so an anonymous source, that it had to do with the election integrity issues. How Trump wanted the team to talk about how what he was saying, questioning the election, how there was an actual basis to that. How that, he wanted that to be part of the strategy. And according to CNN's reporting, the lawyers disagreed with him. Alright, what's the outline here? Starts out with that thesis, and then says the GOP is actually sticking with Trump, and then it spends a lot of time talking about this Representative Green. Was it like Marjorie Green? I'm blanking on her first name. But, yeah. Yeah, Marjorie Taylor Greene. So, that's the third one. Then it goes back to talking about the GOP members and how the ones who voted against Trump in the impeachment are actually the ones facing more heat politically. And finally, it talks more about Representative Green and about how she's lying. That's how the article closes out. So even though the headline is about Trump, probably about half of the article is about this Representative Green. So that's a little bit of a mislead. That's a little bit of a misdirect. Anytime there's an incongruity between the title and the text, between the title and the body of the article, that's a mislead. That's a misdirect. Alright, let's get into the named deception tactics. First one here, the straw man feigning ignorance. So this is the quote from the article. After a brief flirtation with reason and sound judgment in the weeks following the January 6th siege at the Capitol, the Republican Party has decided to honor their deep and often blind allegiance to Trump, choosing to overlook his role in inciting the deadly insurrection, rather than pay the price of crossing him and his base next year at the ballot box. So that implies that voting to acquit Trump is done either out of allegiance to Trump, their deep and often blind allegiance to Trump, or for one's own electoral prospects. Pay the price of crossing him and his base next year at the ballot box. It completely ignores the constitutionality argument, which 45 senators already stated their position on. There was that vote where 45 GOP senators stated or voted that they thought it's unconstitutional to impeach a president that's already left office. And they also completely ignore any other arguments, like that it was protected political speech, that what he said was not against the law, and that what you impeach someone on needs to be a crime. So yeah, that's a straw man feigning ignorance, because they didn't consider any of the other arguments. They just say the only reason you're doing it here is for one of those two reasons. Next up, the judiciary and the legal profession are adhering to a higher ethical standard and have largely refused to tolerate his efforts to ramrod the nation's democratic institutions and founding principles throughout his baseless election charade. So it doesn't go into much detail here, and that might be to avoid saying something too easily falsifiable here. The relevant fact being omitted here, the way a lot of these articles used to frame it, is that the courts had proven that all of the election irregularities were false, that there was no election fraud, that the courts had adjudicated on the issue and they had found that everything was hunky-dory, something along those lines. So they were a little more circumspect with the language here. The relevant fact they're omitting is that the courts refused to hear almost all of the cases. They were dismissed on procedural grounds, standing, mootness, etc. And that includes the Texas case, which it brought to the only court that could possibly hear it, and it was dismissed for standing. It was one state suing another, and it was brought directly to the Supreme Court. So there's no other country in the nation, or no other court in the nation, which could hear that case, and the one court that did have jurisdiction dismissed it for lack of standing. And that was the pattern throughout a lot of these cases, is that the legal profession adhering to a higher ethical standard is the legal profession refusing to hear election fraud cases. Or not even necessarily election fraud. That wasn't about election fraud. That was about changing election laws unconstitutionally. But anything on that subject, the courts were hesitant to deal with it. And that's what they didn't discuss here. Alright. Undue emotion. Undue emotion is a name manipulation tactic here, because some topics are necessarily going to be emotional, but when a writer of one of these articles makes it unduly emotional, more emotional than it needs to be, that is done for effect. When a reader is more emotional, they are less rational. They're gonna follow their gut more than their mind, and they're gonna be more easily drawn to more irrational arguments. So here, if we look at the same text, they're implying, or they're painting Republicans as actors more favorable to an insurrectionist than to the Constitution. They're they're saying that, yeah, baseless election charade, is so Trump's efforts have been to ramrod the nation's democratic institutions with a baseless election charade. You could have expressed that same content through less loaded language, and they packaged it up in that way to really inflame people's emotions, rile people up, and part of the reason you do that is to make people feel more jazzed up about this article because they're more emotional about it. They want to come back for that endorphin rush more to CNN, these articles that get them all emotional. But another reason is that when you're all jazzed up and emotioned up, your rationality goggles aren't quite as in tune. It's easier for them to push their directed narrative on you. So keep your eyes out for that. All right, another example of undue emotion. They use this term or this phrase, quiver. They described Republicans quivering in the face of Trump's election threats. That same language, the behavior they're describing there could have been said, vote against an unconstitutional impeachment, or vote against what they perceive to be an unconstitutional impeachment. But the way the writers of this article are saying is quivering in the face of his election threats. So that's assuming that there's no legitimate basis the Republicans would be voting in that way. And it's using language to describe it that they're having this emotional reaction to scary Trump is the reason they're voting this way. So that's undue emotion right there. Alright, let's move on to this final section, sort of big picture stuff. What else was going on here? So this article was not labeled opinion, it was labeled analysis right there. CNN does have articles, some of them are labeled opinion, and this was not one of them, but it was clearly an opinion piece. This was a quick little line just showing the tonality, making the GOP's loyalty to Trump even more appalling. I mean, that's not neutral writing there, that's clearly opinionated writing. This was just an opinion piece, but it was not labeled as much. That's very misleading. Some people are going to read this and think they're just reading the news. Okay, this was interesting. So they had this quote, his insistence that the November election was rigged against him. It's different language than they normally use. It would normally be something about his insistence that there was voter fraud or that there was widespread voter fraud. But here they said the election was rigged against him. So I don't know why they're using this language, but it's much easier to argue against. One of the main arguments is how the electoral laws were changed in 2020 by bodies other than the state legislatures, by secretaries of states, by state courts, and they were changed in ways that almost exclusively helped Biden. A lot of these were COVID related changes, a lot of them expanded mail in ballots, which tend to favor Democrats. So, a lot of, all of the changes to election law, which happened the year of the most contentious election in recent memory, all of those changes, favored one side. And were those changes constitutional? That is a very good question. The courts refused to answer the question. So was it rigged against him? That's very much an open question. It's a much easier case for people on Trump's side to make than the one proving that there was widespread voter fraud that overturned the election. So it's interesting that they're using that language, which is much less defensible. Uh, and the last note is they use the term insurrection a number of times describing what happened at the Capitol, and I think that term is inappropriate. Even if a few of the rioters there did have serious plans to execute the government of the United States, which has not been shown by convincing evidence. I have not seen that evidence. It has not been made public. Uh, we would still need to know how many people that was. If it was only 6 people out of the thousands there, then describing that whole movement, describing everyone protesting there as insurrectionists would be wrong. That would be inappropriate. Um, but even beyond that, even if there were those 6 people there, which again, we don't know. There might have been zero. We don't have evidence that there was a single one person who is seriously planning to do that. Some of the evidence they talked about is like that shaman guy putting a note on, what was it, Pence's desk that said justice will be served. That's just like a vague QAnon type thing. He might be saying because like the FBI is going to come down because they've been on Trump's team the whole time. Who the heck knows what that means? Till we see real evidence that these guys were there to assassinate people, I'm withholding judgment. But even if there were a handful of people there that were planning to assassinate people, they sure as heck didn't have an alternative government to install. So it was not an insurrection attempt. Not even close. So even that small handful of people were not attempting an insurrection attempt, and the vast majority of people who were there had nothing to do with it. Even if that small handful of people did exist, they were not attempting an insurrection. And as for all the other people, they were even less involved. Alright, that's about what I got for this one. Might have been some stuff I missed. Pretty long article. Let me know if you think I missed anything, or if there's any places where you disagree. I'll see you next time.